He Fell in Love with His Wife by Edward Payson Rowe. Chapter 16. Mrs. Mumpson's Vicissitudes. Having completed her preparations for supper, Jane stole timidly up to Holcroft's room to summon him. Her first rap on his door was scarcely audible. Then she ventured to knock louder and finally to call him, but there was no response. Full of vague dread, she went to her mother's room and said, "He won't answer me. He's so awful mad that I don't know what he'll do." "I think he has left his apartment," her mother moaned from the bed. "Why couldn't you tell me so before?" cried Jane. "What you're gone to bed for? If you'd only show some sense and try to do what he brought you here for, like enough he'd keep us yet." "My heart's too crushed, Jane." "Oh, bother, bother," said the child, and rushed away. She looked into the dark parlor and called, "Mr. Holcroft!" Then she appeared in the kitchen again, the picture of uncouth distress and perplexity. A moment later she opened the door and darted toward the barn. "What do you wish, Jane?" said Holcroft, emerging from a shadowy corner and recalling her. Supper's ready," sobbed the child. He came in and sat down at the table, considerately appearing not to notice her until she had a chance to recover composure. She vigorously used the sleeve of both arms in drying her eyes, then stole in and found a seat in a dusky corner. "Why don't you come to supper?" he asked quietly. "Don't want any." "You had better take some up to your mother." "She oughtn't to have any." "That doesn't make any difference. I want you to take up something to her, and when you come down, then come and eat your supper like a sensible girl." "I ain't been sensible, nor mother neither." "Do as I say, Jane." The child obeyed, but she couldn't swallow anything but a little coffee. Holcroft was in a quandary. He had not the gift of speaking soothing yet meaningless words, and was too honest to raise false hopes. He was, therefore, almost as silent and embarrassed as Jane herself. To the girl's furtive scrutiny, he did not seem hardened against her, and she at last ventured, "Say, I didn't touch them drawers after you told me not to do anything on the sly." "When were they opened? Tell me the truth, Jane." "Mother opened him the first day you left us alone. I told her you wouldn't like it, but she said she was housekeeper. She said how it was her duty to inspect everything. I wanted to inspect, too. We was just rummaging, that's what it was. After the things were all pulled out, Mother got the rocker and wouldn't do anything. It was getting late, and I was frightened and poked him back in a hurry. Mother wanted to rummage again the other day, and I wouldn't let her. Then she wouldn't let me have the key so I could fix him up." "But the keys were in my pocket, Jane." "Mother has a lot of keys. I've told you just how it all was." "Nothing was taken away?" "No. Mother ain't got sense, but she never takes things. Another sense when I'm hungry. Never took anything here." "Say, are you going to send us away?" "I fear I shall have to, Jane. I'm sorry for you, for I believe that you would try to do the best you could if given a chance. And I can see you never had a chance." "No," said the child, blinking hard to keep the tears out of her eyes. "I ain't had no teaching. I just kind of growed along with the farm hands and rough boys. Them that didn't hate me teased me. Say, couldn't I stay in your barn and sleep in the hay?" Holcroft was sorely perplexed and pushed away his half-eaten supper. He knew himself what it was to be friendless and lonely, and his heart softened toward this worse than motherless child. "Jane," he said kindly, "I'm just as sorry for you as I can be, but you don't know the difficulties in the way of what you wish, and I fear I can't make you understand them. Indeed, it would not be best to tell you all of them. If I could keep you at all, you should stay in the house, and I'd be kind to you, but it can't be. I may not stay here myself. My future course is very uncertain. There's no use of my trying to go on as I have. Perhaps someday I can do something for you, and if I can, I will. I will pay your mother her 3 months' wages in full in the morning, and then I want you both to get your things into your trunk, and I'll take you to your cousin Lemuel's." Driven almost to desperation, Jane suggested the only scheme she could think of. "If you stayed here and I run away and come back, wouldn't you keep me? I'd work all day and just all night just for the sake of staying." "No, Jane," said Holcroft firmly. "You'd make me no end of trouble if you did that. If you'll be a good girl and learn how to do things, I'll try to find you a place among kind people some day when you're older and can act for yourself." "You're afraid for I hear mother had come a-visiting," said the girl keenly. "You're too young to understand half the trouble that might follow. My plans are too uncertain for me to tangle myself up. You and your mother must go away at once, so I can do what I must do before it's too late in the season. Here's a couple of dollars, which you can keep for yourself." And he went up to his room, feeling that he could not witness the child's distress any longer. He fought hard against despondency and tried to face the actual condition of his affairs. "I might have known," he thought, "that things would have turned out just somewhat as they have, with such women in the house, and I don't see much of a chance of getting better ones. I've been so bent on staying and going on as I used to that I've just shut my eyes to the fact." He got out an old account book and pored over it a long time. The entries therein were blind enough, but at last he concluded, "It's plain that I've lost money on the dairy ever since my wife died, and the prospects now are worse than ever. That weak stripe will set the whole town talking against me, and it'll be just about impossible to get a decent woman to come here. I might as well have an auction and sell all the cows, but one at once. After that, if I find I can't make out a living alone, I'll put the place in better order and sell a rent. I can get my own meals after a fashion, and old Jonathan Johnson's wife will do my washing and mending. It's time it was done better than it has been, for some of my clothes make me look like a scarecrow. I believe Jonathan will come with his cross dog and stay here too when I must be away. Well, it's a hard lot for a man, but I'd be about as bad off and 100-fold more lonely if I went anywhere else. I can only feel my way along and live a day at a time. I'll learn what can be done and what can't be. One thing is clear. I can't go on with this Mrs. Mumpson in the house a day longer. She makes me creep and crawl all over, and the first thing I know I shall be swearing like a bloody pirate unless I get rid of her. She wasn't such a hopeless idiot. I'd let her stay for the sake of Jane, but I won't pay her good wages to make my life a burden a day longer." And with like self-communings, he spent the evening until the habit of early drowsiness overcame him. The morning found Jane dispirited and a little sullen, as older and wiser people are apt to be when disappointed. She employed herself in getting breakfast carelessly and languidly, and the result was not satisfactory. "Where's your mother?" Holcroft asked when he came in. "She told me to tell you she was indisposed." "Indisposed to go to Lemuel Weeks?" "I expect she means she's sick." He frowned and looked suspiciously at the girl. Here was a new complication, and very possibly a trick. "What's the matter with her?" "Dunno." "Well, she had better get well soon enough to go by this afternoon," he remarked, controlling his irritation with difficulty, and nothing more was said. Full of his new plans, he spent a busy forenoon and then came to dinner. It was the same old story. He went up and knocked at Mrs. Mumpson's door, saying that he wished to speak with her. "I'm too indisposed to transact business," she replied feebly. "You must be ready tomorrow morning," he called. "I have business plans which can't be delayed." And he turned away, muttering rather sulphurous words. "He will relent. His hard heart will soften at last." But we shall not weary the reader with the long soliloquies with which she beguiled her politic seclusion, as she regarded it. Poor, unsophisticated Jane made matters worse. The condition of life among her much-visited relatives now existed again. She was not wanted, and her old sly, sullen, and furtive manner reassured itself. Much of Holcroft's sympathy was thus alienated, yet he partially understood and pitied her. It became, however, all the more clear that he must get rid of both mother and child, and that further relations with either of them could only lead to trouble. The following morning Jane appeared. "Is your mother really sick?" he asked. "Suppose so," was the laconic reply. "You haven't taken much pains with breakfast, Jane. 'Tain't no use." With knitted brows he thought deeply and silently ate the wretched meal which had been prepared. Then, remarking that he might do some writing, he went up to a small attic room which had been used occasionally by a hired man. It contained a covered pipe-hole leading to the chimney flue. Removing the cover, he stopped up the flue with an old woolen coat. "I suppose I'll have to meet tricks with tricks," he muttered. Returning to his own apartment, he lighted a fire in the stove and laid upon the kindling blaze some dampened wood, then went out and quietly hitched his horses to the wagon. The pungent odor of smoke soon filled the house. The cover over the pipe-hole in Mrs. Mumpson's room was not very secure, and thick volumes began to pour in upon the startled widow. "Jane!" she shrieked. If Jane was stolen toward Holcroft, she was furious at her mother, and paid no heed at first to her cry. "Jane! Jane! The house is on fire!" Then the child did fly up the stairway. The smoke seemed to confirm the words of her mother, who was dressing in hot haste. "Run and tell Mr. Holcroft!" she cried. "I won't," said the girl. "If he won't keep us in the house, I don't care if he don't have any house." "No, no, tell him!" screamed Mrs. Mumpson. "If we save his house, he will relent. Gratitude will overwhelm him. So far from turning us away, he will sue. He will plead forgiveness for his former harshness. His home so saved will be our home won. Just put our things in the trunk first. Perhaps the house can't be saved, and you know we must save our things. Help me quick. There, now. Both were sneezing and choking in half-strangled manner. "Now let me lock it. Oh, my hand trembles so. Take hold and draw it out. Drag it downstairs, no matter how it scratches things." Having reached the hall below, she opened the door and shrieked for Holcroft. Jane also began running toward the barn. The farmer came hastily out and shouted, "What's the matter?" "The house is on fire!" they screamed in chorus. To carry out his ruse, he ran swiftly to the house. Mrs. Mumpson stood before him, wringing her hands and crying, "Oh, dear Mr. Holcroft, can't I do anything to help you? I would so like to help you." And, "My good woman, yes. Let me get in the door and see what's the matter. Oh, here's your trunk. That's sensible. Better get it outside." And he went up the stairs 2 steps at a time and rushed into his room. "Jane! Jane!" ejaculated Mrs. Mumpson, sinking on a seat in the porch. "He called me his good woman." But Jane was busy dragging the trunk out of the doors. Having secured her own and her mother's worldly possessions, she called, "Shall I bring water and carry things out?" "No," he replied, "not yet. There's something the matter with the chimney." And he hastened up to the attic room, removed the clog from the flue, put on the cover again, and threw open the window. Returning, he locked the door of the room which Mrs. Mumpson had occupied and came downstairs. "I must get a ladder and examine the chimney," he said as he passed. "Oh, my dear Holcroft," the widow began. "Can't talk with you yet," and he hastened on. "As soon as he's sure the house is safe, Jane, all will be well." But the girl had grown helpless and hopeless and cynical. She had not penetrated his scheme to restore her mother to health, but understood the man well enough to be sure that her mother's hopes would end as they had in the past. She sat down apathetically on the trunk to see what would happen next. After a brief inspection, Holcroft came down from the roof and said, "The chimney will have to be repaired," which was true enough, and equally so of other parts of the dwelling. The fortunes of the owner were reflected in the appearance of the building. If it were a possible thing, Holcroft wished to carry out his ruse undetected, and he hastened upstairs again, ostensibly to see that all danger had passed, but in reality to prepare his mind for an intensely disagreeable interview. "I'd rather face a mob of men than that one idiotic woman," he muttered. "I could calculate the actions of a setting hen with her head cut off better than I can this widow's. but there's no help for it. And he came down looking very resolute. I've let the fire in my stove go out, and there's no more danger, he said quietly, as he sat down on the porch opposite Mrs. Mumpson. "Oh," she exclaimed with a long breath of relief. "We've saved the dwelling. What would we have done if it had burned down? We would have been homeless." "That may be my condition soon as it is," he said coldly. "I am very glad, Mrs. Mumpson, that you are so much better. As Jane told you, I suppose I will pay you the sum I agreed to give you for 3 months' service." "My dear Holcroft, my nerves have been too shaken to talk business this morning." And the widow leaned back and looked as if she were going to faint. "I'm only a poor lone woman," she added feebly, "and you cannot be so lacking in the milk of human kindness as to take advantage of me." "No, madame, nor shall I allow you and Lemuel Weeks to take advantage of me. This is my house, and I have a right to make my own arrangements." "It might be all arranged so easily in another way," sighed the widow. "It cannot be arranged in any other way," he began. "Mr. Holcroft," she cried, leaning suddenly forward with clasped hands and speaking effusively, "you but now called me your good woman. Think how much those words mean. Make them true. Now that you've spoken them, then you won't be homeless and will never need a caretaker." "Are you making me an offer of marriage?" he asked with lowering brow. "Oh, no, indeed," she simpered. "That wouldn't be becoming in me. I'm only responding to your own words." Rising, he said sternly, "No power on earth could induce me to marry you, and that would be plain enough if you were in your right mind. I shall not stand this foolishness another moment. You must go with me at once to Lemuel Weeks. If you will not, I'll have you taken to an insane asylum." "To an insane asylum? What for?" she half shrieked, springing to her feet. "You'll see," he replied, going down the steps. "Jump up, Jane. I shall take the trunk to your cousin's. If you are so crazy as to stay in a man's house when he don't want you and won't have you, you are fit only for an asylum." Mrs. Mumpson was sane enough to perceive that she was at the end of her adhesive resources. In his possession of her trunk, the farmer also had a strategic advantage which made it necessary for her to yield. She did so, however, with very bad grace. When he drove up, she bounced into the wagon as if made of India rubber, while Jane followed slowly with a look of sullen apathy. He touched his horses with the whip into a smart trot, scarcely daring to believe in his good fortune. The lane was rather steep and rough, and he soon had to pull up lest the object of his unhappy solicitude should be jolted out of the vehicle. This gave the widow her chance to open fire. "The end has not come yet, Mr. Holcroft," she said vindictively. "You may think that you are going to have an easy triumph over a poor, friendless, unfortunate, sensitive, afflicted woman and a fatherless child, but you shall soon learn that there's law in the land. You have addressed improper words to me. You have threatened me. You have broken your agreement. I have writings. I have a memory. I have language to plead the cause of the widow and the fatherless. I have been wronged, outraged, trampled upon, and then turned out of doors. The indignant world shall hear my story. The finger of scorn will be pointed at you. Your name will be a byword and a hissing. Respectable woman, respectably connected, will stand aloof and shudder." The torrent of words was unchecked except when the wheels struck the stone, jolting her so severely that her jaws came together with a click as if she were snapping at him. He made no reply whatsoever, but longed to get his hands upon Lemuel Weeks. Pushing his horses to a high rate of speed, he soon reached that interested neighbor's door, intercepting him just as he was starting to town. He looked very sour as he saw his wife's relatives, and demanded harshly, "What does this mean?" "It means," cried Mrs. Mumpson in her high, cackling tones, "that he's said and done things too awful to speak of, that he's broken his agreement and turned us out of doors." "Jim Holcroft," Mr. Weeks said, blustering up to the wagon, "you can't carry on with this high hand. Take these people back to your house where they belong, or you'll be sorry." Holcroft sprang out, whirled Mr. Weeks out of his way, took out the trunk, and with equal expedition and no more ceremony, lifted down Mrs. Mumpson and Jane. "Do you know what you're about?" shouted Mr. Weeks in a rage. "I'll have the law on you this very day." Holcroft maintained his ominous silence as he hitched his horse securely. Then he strode toward Weeks, who backed away from him. "Oh, don't be afraid, you sneaking, cowardly fox," said the farmer bitterly. "If I gave you your deserts, I'd take my horsewhip to you. You're going to law me, are you? Well, begin today, and I'll be ready for you. I won't demean myself by answering that woman, but I'm ready for you in any way you've a mind to come. I've put you and your wife on the witness stand. I'll summon 𝚅𝚌𝚙𝚝𝚎, as you call him, and his wife, and compel you under all oath to give Mrs. Mumpson a few testimonials. I'll prove the trick you played on me and the lies you told. I'll prove that this woman in my absence invaded my room and with keys of her own opened my dead wife's bureau and pulled out her things. I'll prove that she hasn't earned her salt and can't and may prove something more. Now, if you want to go to the law, begin. Nothing would please me better than to show up you and your tribe. I have offered to pay this woman her 3 months' wages in full, and so have kept my agreement. She has not kept hers, for she's only sat in a rocking chair and made trouble. Now do as you please. I'll give you all the law you want. I'd like to add a horsewhipping, but that would give you a case, and now you haven't any." As Holcroft uttered these words sternly and slowly, like a man angry indeed, but under perfect self-control, the perspiration broke out on Weeks's face. He was aware that Mrs. Mumpson was too well known to play the role of a wronged woman, and remembered what his testimony and that of many others would be under oath. Therefore he began, "Oh, well, Mr. Holcroft, there's no need of your getting in such a rage and threaten me so. I'm willing to talk the matter over and only want to do the square thing." The farmer made a gesture of disgust as he said, "I understand you, Lemuel Weeks. There's no talking needed, and I'm in no mood for it. Here's the money I agreed to pay. I'll give it to Mrs. Mumpson when she has signed this paper, and you've signed as witness of her signature. Otherwise, it's law. Now decide quick, I'm in a hurry." Objections were interposed, and Holcroft, returning the money to his pocket, started for his team without a word. "Oh, well," said Weeks in strong irritation. "I haven't time for a lawsuit at this season of the year. You're both cranks, and I suppose it would be best for me and my folks to be rid of you both. It's a pity, though, you couldn't be married and left to fight it out." Holcroft took the whip from his wagon and said quietly, "If you speak another insulting word, I'll horsewhip you and take my chances." Something in the man's look prevented Weeks from uttering another unnecessary word. The business was soon transacted, accompanied with Mrs. Mumpson's venomous words, for she had discovered that she could stigmatize Holcroft with impunity. He went to Jane and shook her hand as he said good-bye. "I'm sorry for you, and I won't forget my promise," then drove rapidly away. "Cousin Lemuel," Mrs. Mumpson said plaintively, "won't you have Timothy take my trunk to our room?" "No, I won't," he snapped. "You've had your chance and you fooled it away. I was just going to town, and you and Jane will go along with me." And he put the widow's trunk into his wagon. Mrs. Weeks came out and wiped her eyes ostentatiously with her apron as she whispered, "I can't help it, Cynthy. When Lemuel goes off the handle in this way, it's no use for me to say anything." Mrs. Mumpson wept hysterically as she was driven away. Jane's sullen and apathetic aspect had passed away in part, for Holcroft's words had kindled something like hope.